There we go. Okay, everybody, thank you for joining us. I have with me here Ryan from Pessimistic Idealism. He has a YouTube channel as well, so I'll put that in the description. You can go and have a look at that. And Jordan from Monistic Idealism, who is another idealist, as you may guess from the names of these channels, his channel will be in the description as well. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about my guests here before we jump into discussing Bradley's introduction for Appearance and Reality. Ryan is a history major, and he's very interested in British idealism in particular, not just idealism in general, but British idealism and some of its associated American thinkers, and some European ones, and some sort of more recent that followed on from that. So he's the expert on the particular thinkers of the period. I'm going to be drawing on his vast knowledge as we go for comparison and deeper insight. So thanks Ryan for joining us. And Jordan is interested in idealism, but I believe most of the stuff he's been reading and looking at is more recent work in idealism, more recent arguments for idealism and monism as well. But he has an interest at looking at the 19th century idealists, early 20th century idealists that we're looking at too. So he's coming a bit more fresh-faced, but very interested and philosophically aware. So I think we've got a good mix, and I'm done a bit of reading, interested to learn more, and going on this journey with you guys as well. So I just thought to kick things off, so you can get a feel for us. I'll just ask each of them how they discovered idealism, what drew them to it, and why they're still so keen about this stuff. Start with you, Ryan.
Sure. So hi, I'm Ryan. I run the channel Pessimistic Idealism. I would say that I first became acquainted with idealistic thinking through the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, and that would have been about 5 years ago. And I gradually progressed through Schopenhauer towards more richer philosophical systems, I think. So I moved on from that to Hegel to the British idealists, as well as the American idealists of the late 19th and early 20th century. And I found their writing and their ideas to be very captivating and very inspiring. And it really inspired me personally to begin publishing videos on YouTube, recording audiobooks, and as well as pursuing my own philosophical interests.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Jordan?
Excellent. Hi, everybody. My name is, you all know me as Monistic Idealism, but my real first name is Jordan. And how I got interested in idealism was, I guess back it was around 2013, late 2014, I was really interested in substance dualism because of my Christian upbringing. I kind of just assumed that was sort of just a default view. A lot of my fellow Christians were very substance dualistic in their thinking. And I became disillusioned with that view, with the interaction problem and just in general, the dualistic attitude towards, just the body, there's the mind and all that with mental health and everything. And there was a user by the name of Inspiring Philosophy who worked with another user named Johann Rotz. And they published this video called The Introspective Argument. And when I heard that argument, it really turned me on to different ways of thinking, that there is another way out of this. You don't have to settle for materialism. You don't have to settle for dualism. You can instead have something that has the strengths of both without any of their weaknesses. And I've just been sticking course ever since. And I've seen that it's neglected. There's not much out there nowadays about idealism. So I've just been sort of thinking about how to put it in a modern context and other arguments that can help bring the contemporary thinker into this. And it's just been a really exciting journey.
Okay, great. Right, well, there's going to be a new chapter with all of this for us. Maybe not quite so new for Ryan, but certainly for us. And so, okay, great. So what I thought then is we're going to be talking about the introduction to Bradley's Appearance and Reality, following on from, if you haven't seen it, I'll put it in the card. I read the introduction out and just sort of explained it a little bit what he's talking about. But this is more to sort of discuss certain points that are brought out of it, maybe criticize some of the things he's saying, compare it with how most philosophers think about things in the more recent or in the current climate, and just how what we thought of it, whether it was inspiring or difficult, etc. So this is going to be pretty free flowing, but I've got a few kind of questions to kick things off. Oh, actually, no, before we do that, sorry, I think it's going to be really helpful for getting a bit of an idea about the book itself, some of the structure of the book, and what happened when it got published and the reaction to it. And so, Ryan, this is your area. Can you sort of tell us a bit about the book?
Sure. So Appearance and Reality was published by F.H. Bradley in 1893. It was one could say it was the second of his, or third of his major works after Ethical Studies and a book on logic called The Principles of Logic. The book is essentially an analysis of experience and analysis of our common ways of thinking. And Bradley, he takes the reader through a kind of pilgrim's progress, analyzing our different conceptions of what we take to be real or appearance. And he says that many of these conceptions are inconsistent, untenable, and fail to live up to the criterion that we set out from in the beginning, and which he terms intellectual satisfaction. Now, the reception of the book was mixed, but it had generally, in philosophical circles, a positive result, I would say, in many people's reactions. The book, it was anticipated as being a kind of panacea or a kind of remedy to many of the spiritual crises going on at the time in Victorian England. Rather than promising us freedom, God, and immortality, it instead is much more cautious about pursuing such lofty goals, or even the possibility of establishing such truths as that. It is a work that is difficult to understand, especially to outside the academic sphere. And nevertheless, it does offer a very profound understanding, or a profound perspective, I think, into the importance of anyone. So not even the educated student, but even the layman, to really reflect upon their own aims and ideals and what they take to be important and real, and the pathway to even pursuing those interests. And I would say that the book overall, it is incredibly rewarding, a wonderful read. It begins with this mighty crescendo of attacking all of these distinctions and divisions that we tend to make in our everyday experiences. And it culminates in something very grandiose. And then it leaves us at almost like a very calm and contemplative ending, in a sense. It's a very nice read.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I've read it myself. Well, actually, no, I haven't quite finished the last couple of chapters, but it's how does the title fit with the structure of the book? I mean, there's a link there, isn't there?
Yeah, as the title may suggest, there is a theme at work. So the title, Appearance and Reality, it parallels the two divisions, or the division essentially that the book takes. It's divided into two. So there's appearance, which is the first part, and then there's reality, which is the second part. So in Appearance, Bradley, as I was saying before, he analyzes our frequent and everyday conceptions of what we take things to be, the essence of things. So we divide things into things and relations, qualities. We take space and time to be these essentially receptacles that everything real falls into. He attacks certain concepts of selfhood, the relationship between soul and body. All of these criticisms, though, they ultimately are not the end. So rather than just leaving us hanging in a pile of rubble, essentially, conceptual rubble, he then says that, okay, it's not the case that these things don't exist. Rather, they're not fundamental. They're real, but only in a degree. So it's interesting because Bradley, he says that there is really no such thing as a dualism between appearance and reality as such. Rather, reality is its appearances made manifest. And it's attacking this dualism, this division between things in themselves and what things are for us that Bradley's really going after. And he's attacking superficial skepticism and agnosticism with respect to certain philosophical doctrines that were prevalent at the time when he was writing, like the works of many Kantian influence, many British thinkers that were influenced by the writings of Kant and Hume at the time. That's who he was really attacking. But in essence, he attempts to try and tie together all of these inconsistencies and fragmentary aspects of experience into a grand absolute, essentially. So ultimate reality, which he essentially calls the absolute, is the one, essentially, the one in the many. It's similar to what we take to be that into which everything can be reduced, or out of which everything can be explained. It's the infinite. And the book ultimately ends in a very cautious way. So Bradley, he says, okay, we've established certain things, but we still nevertheless have these ultimate doubts as to whether there's a future life, whether or not, so like the problem of evil too, he discusses that's very important for him, morality, even truth, these concepts that we hold very dear. He says that we are in a position that is not, we're not high enough in a sense to pass certain judgments about things with certainty. So he does leave us with having to come to terms with our finitude. But at the same time, though, he says that there is, we should not fear, in a sense. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. I think that's good. I think that helps us to kind of have a bit of a taste to what we might be getting ourselves into as we go through. Because, as you said, his concerns are broader than just what I found too many of the sort of concerns of more recent people defending monism in the literature at the moment. In that, Bradley's not restricting his view to some kind of concrete or physical world, trying to say that that's one. He's wanting to take any kind of concept or category we might have and show how that these things are all ultimately manifestations or manifested in the absolute, right? So he's interested in questions about goodness and truth, the soul or the mind or our selfhood, and sort of the whole thing. So we have this grand vision for the book. It's a very, very comprehensive metaphysical view, and I should say it sounds all very mystical and large and grand, but we are going to be looking at some very specific arguments. And what's interesting is that in some ways he set up the principles from which he's going to argue in the introduction that we're going to look at. So you'd mentioned there, Ryan, about this sort of intellectual satisfaction and sort of how that plays a role in him separating appearance from reality. And then, like you say, he sort of there's this separation and then brings everything back together again at the end. So we can't have an overly strict separation of appearance and reality. But yeah, so it's an interesting place to end up, and I think quite exciting. And I certainly have found it as interesting as you. So thanks for that. Jordan, I was going to ask you that. So this is the first time, I presume this is the first time you've actually been reading the primary text of this anyway. So what were your kind of first impressions and diving into the introduction compared to some other stuff you've been reading and looking at?
Yeah, I've read here and there certain pieces of Bradley, mainly because of, I guess, some sort of informal lectures from Ryan here. I've known him for a while, and he's taught me a lot about Bradley, and we've had lots of discussions on this, and he's taken certain chapters and we've just sort of explored them. And I've read some of them on my own, but I've really listened to a lot as well. So you're right that this is really the first time I really like sat down and like fully really got into the introduction and read it all the way through without pausing and coming back to it, whatever. And the first thing that that struck me was how eloquent he really was. It was such a very beautiful way of writing and speaking that I'm not used to as a contemporary reader. Everything is so formal in this kind of almost scientific, mathematical sense, and everyone's trying to be real precise in the analytic tradition, which is also appreciated. There's a reason for that, but there's a spirit to Bradley's writing, and he really comes off as being this character. And there's so much that I've learned about him. I don't know if I'll be able to share a picture of you, but there's this famous portrait of Bradley where he looks like he resembles the world's most interesting man, almost. Remember those old beer commercials? And he really is just this fascinating figure, and it comes out in his writing. And I was really refreshed with what he had to say about the importance of metaphysics and what he has to say about those who want to reject it. I don't know if I'm getting too far ahead if I comment too much on this right now, but what he says is for those who want to reject metaphysics, if you want to deny that we can do it, or if you want to say that it's useless, I think he gives very refreshing arguments against that, because we still encounter that to this day, where people think they can just sort of get away with this pragmatism, or that they can have this sort of limited sort of skepticism where we can't get into the ultimate nature of reality, but we can know other things. And Bradley just shows how mistaken that is. And there were some errors with some things that he said there. Would you mind if I shared some of that real quick, or is that getting too far ahead? Okay.
Yeah, you can. I was going to just pick up on one thing you said, actually, which
yes, go ahead, sure.
As well. But keep those questions, because I think it's fine to go to them next. I'm happy with this to go wherever it leads. But I hadn't thought about this before, but his writing style, as you say, is different. It isn't in the sort of the clean-cut, precise, bordering on sterile writing style of kind of contemporary analytic philosophy. And I wonder if how much of that is a legacy of the areas of interest. So we already spoke about how metaphysics, that certainly the metaphysics I've been reading, even those who are interested in idealism, it's still got the sort of focus on what we think of as the scientific world, or what science tries to describe to us, some kind of the concrete world or something similar. In which case it's sort of emulates science itself, and then that is it. And obviously analytic philosophy sort of began with mathematicians, a desire to sort of explain mathematics, the logicism project. And so maybe part of that writing style has come from a different area of interest. And so it'd be interesting to know as we go whether you think Bradley could deal with these topics, whether they are even amenable to a much more kind of formal scientific style, or actually if his writing style and I suppose his rhetorical style is part of the message. I mean, I suppose that's a Marshall McLuhan thing, the medium is the message a little bit. That and for example, my thesis is on Frege, and Frege is the opposite. He's very clear, there's this and there's this, but then Frege's understanding of the world is that we have concepts and they have sharp boundaries, and there's a set of objects that fit any concept. And obviously Bradley is in a sense trying to instead show the connections between things, and sometimes that's expressed less in an analytic, break things down, scientific kind of understanding and more in seeing the connections between things, which is what natural language tends to do. You know, our language develops and grows. We borrow words with certain associations, etc. But I don't know if necessarily that makes the arguments, the positions he comes to, less rigorous. I'll be honest, I think the jury's out on that one for me. Yeah, I'm interested sort of, because like you, I'm used to having everything very, very clearly laid out, and I'm starting from this assumption, and this is what I prove within these conditional limits, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, you could go.
Oh no, I was just going to say real quick. Yeah, because I agree that, like, I think trying to translate Bradley into this modern kind of formalism we have today, I think could do it injustice. But in no way do I think that invalidates the validity of the arguments, or that they're somehow not as good as today's. I think that would just be a prejudice, to just take one's own time right now, as this is the way to do it. I think Bradley is expressing something with content, with substance. He's, like you said, I agree with what you said here about the medium being just as important as the message, if they're not the same. So he's trying to tell you something that not just mere ordinary language can express. I think he's trying to really capture something about the absolute, about ultimate reality, that I think is going to require using language in a bit more of a sophisticated way. But it's also stylistic, and it can be difficult to understand. But ultimately, I see why he does it, and I think it's beautiful.
Yeah. Can I just ask, pick on your brain a little bit with this, Ryan? Because I've read something by Tom Baldwin, who when he's as analytic philosophy as you can get, and he looks at a lot of the analytics. I've read a lot of his stuff on Frege, but he's also written some stuff on Bradley and showing some of the similarities and comparing them a bit. And I'm sure I read somewhere that, I think it's in the Oxford Handbook of Truth, that unlike, say, Hegel or some of the people who influenced the British idealists, the British idealists still had that British empiricist sort of element to their thinking. And so the idealist logic, so I've read bits of Principles of Logic. I haven't read any of Bosanquet's logic or anything. But
if it's difficult.
Okay, but even the fact that that they saw metaphysics as tied up with logic and philosophy of language and meaning, which is exactly how metaphysics is done in the analytic tradition as well. At least they see that language is a big part of it, how we reason, how we do logic. Now, I mean, whereas Hegel's logic is a lot more kind of push-pull dialectical in nature, from what I understand. Is there quite a big break between the way the British idealists approached metaphysics that makes it more sort of accessible to an analytic philosopher than some of the German stuff?
I would say that I think it does have to do, so the English or the British idealists, I would say it's that British flair about it with respect to language and clarity and concreteness about it. So with Hegel, the terms that he uses and the ways of expressing things, so like something's in itself, it's for itself, it's in and for itself, it can be very, very, very difficult to grasp. And what's interesting is many people that study Hegel that are German, they read the English translation of it, because it's impossible to read in many German readers say they just can't do it.
Same with Kant, actually.
Yeah, it's I think there's something about it. The fact that it's so with respect to literary backgrounds too, we have like someone like Thomas Carlyle or Coleridge. There's definitely a literary origin with British idealism. So they do have background, or they do have a they're coming from an environment that is fertilized with very rich and imagery, in a sense, when it comes to language, as well as like poetry too. That's something important. I mean, Bradley himself, with respect to his writing style, I would say that it's definitely influenced by his views. he says in one footnote, I can't remember which, if it was in, I think it was in Essays on Truth and Reality. I might be mistaken, but he says something along the lines of as the older he gets, he says that the poetry is much more, does reality more justice in a sense than mere like formal thinking, or even just what philosophy can do. Poetry is able to capture the spirit of concreteness and reality that he seeks to establish or seeks to capture in his own writing style. So I would say that it's definitely there's definitely an interrelation there. But with respect to analytic philosophy and the British idealists in their writing styles, it is a significant break. And I would have to say that many people say that, like people like Bertrand Russell, they have an excellent writing style. I can't stand his writing style. It's very, very dry.
And wrong.
Yeah, it's almost it's almost tedious in a sense for me personally. But with Bradley, on the other hand, though, it is difficult. It's incredibly. I mean, he often has sometimes he has three different sides of a single question interacting with each other in a single paragraph, and he's personifying both sides, and it can be very difficult to try and keep track of, okay, which side is he in support of, which side is he against? Mm-hmm. I mean, it can be very murky, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's many different conflicting interpretations of what Bradley is even saying, especially his contemporaries. Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question, though.
But so yeah, so I mean, that we've been talking about the writing style there, but also so as I say, I when I started reading Principles of Logic, he says I think he says at the beginning something like, I'm going to try and keep metaphysics out of this as much as possible to just make it about logic, but it's almost impossible to do that because logic and metaphysics are so linked. And even the bits that I read of Principles of Logic, so I did a bit of a reading group on that for a while, you can see how some of the ways he understood about subject and predicate, etc., and his logic is coming out in his metaphysics as well, exactly. The what and the that and bits. Mm-hmm. So there seems to me this connection, at least in the way he's thinking, and also, as I said, Tom Walden was saying they had elements of philosophy of language in there too in their metaphysics. The metaphysics are tied up in terms of meaning and, well, thought, obviously. Without a spoiler alert, thought and being unified. I mean, thought is and I suppose with the way he understands conceptual framework on being applied to experience as well. So again, I don't want to get too far into stuff that's in the future for us, but does that make, do you think, British idealism at least a little bit more familiar territory, or the metaphysics that they do slightly more familiar territory than if you jumped to, say, some of the late German idealists? I mean, I don't know that much about them, so
I would say that there's definitely a progression. I think so. We have so like the German idealists, they were writing in the late, very, very, very late 18th century, and then into the I think when was it 1835? Was that when Hegel died? I can't remember when he died, but essentially in the very early 19th century, that's when the German idealists, they were still around, some of them. And you had Schopenhauer, whether or not he's a German idealist, that's a whole other story. But he was writing until 1860 when he died. And I think there was, during that time, though, so between the German idealists and the British idealists, which came much later, in the later part of the 19th century, there was enough time for it to kind of evolve, I think, into something that is much more, so with respect to the things that were going on in logic, like what's a good example? It's like Bradley, he talks about yeah, well, like Lotze, of course, but he talks about Mill. He talks about Hamilton. He talks about Venn, so like Venn diagrams, things like that. He talks about even the emergence of what he calls like equational logic too, and criticizing the use of like symbolism and things like that. And in logic, I think there was, between the time of the German idealists and the time of the British idealists, there was enough evolution towards what we kind of see today that allows it to be more accessible, I think, to readers today than it would be to jump straight into the German idealists. But I think it's different for each one. So.
Okay. All right. Well, that's something I'm hoping to pursue and find out a little bit more about. Okay. So thanks, Ryan. Let's get into this actual introduction then, because we've been so. Jordan, what was some of your thoughts that you were going to talk about? Was these you're gonna start off by saying some things that you didn't like about it or found questionable or whatever you wanted?
Well, sure. Yeah. So there's one thing. I guess it's a bit of both here. So I really like what he has to say about how if you want to try to say we can't know anything about ultimate reality, well, you seem to be saying something about ultimate reality. So you're refuting yourself. And I'm sympathetic with that line of reasoning. However, someone might try to get around that by saying something like, well, when I confess that I can't know about ultimate reality, I'm not so much saying anything about ultimate reality per se, but myself and my own limitations. So they'll maybe bring up something about language or just other general limitations of human epistemology, whatever. And then they'll try to say that, well, because I can't even know about, let's say, general metaphysical truths, let's say even ordinary objects or just whatever, they say, well, even if I do know something about it, I don't know much about it. And so if I have such limited knowledge there, why would I be able to have knowledge of the ultimate reality and so forth? And I still think someone like Bradley might still have a way around that. They might still be able to object to that by saying something like, well, by you trying to say that you're just talking about epistemology, or I'm just talking about myself as a human and the limits of finite selves, whatever, you are still confessing a metaphysical truth of some sort. You're still implying or suggesting and bringing in this metaphysical baggage that will imply something about ultimate reality, such that, reality can't be known, such that there is something that is real, and such that you are you or whatever. And so there is knowledge. And so I think these people who want to try to dismiss metaphysics, I think Bradley's still going to be able to ensnare them and still be able to say, well, your rejection of metaphysics is still going to entail a sort of metaphysical claim or truth of some sort. So you're going to just fall on your own sword. And so I like that Bradley has this attitude of, we're not going to meditate on this too long, because we shouldn't. Those who want to reject metaphysics are really defeating themselves. They are, as he said, rival metaphysicians. They're just coming at this with their own metaphysical view and trying to proclaim they don't have it, and they're just going to try to tear down everybody else. So, it kind of reminds me of this attitude some people have, where you can either, if you want to have the world's tallest tower, you can either just build your tower taller, or you can just destroy other towers, right? So yours is the only one remaining. So I think these people try to think that, well, if I can just wreck everybody else, I'll be the last man standing, and we'll just have to be left at this default view or whatever.
Yeah. So I had a couple of thoughts on that myself. So one was that because there's a certain sort of attitude of quietism that's sort of popular in different areas here now, which is one that would say, well, I'm not saying that reality is such that it's impossible to know anything about it. I just don't say anything at all, and so you can't get me for making some positive metaphysical claim. But I wondered if that was sort of a way out. It seems quite unsatisfactory, but also Bradley isn't necessarily arguing that we can know anything about reality. He is just arguing that we can't say it's impossible. Because I think I need to sort of have a look at it again, but he's sort of saying if you say impossible to know anything about reality, then you're making a metaphysical claim. Now, I wonder if someone who was saying humans are such that they cannot know anything about reality, does that really get around the problem of it being a metaphysical claim? Because you've still got some kind of relationship between human mind, reality. There's some relationship. You're not just saying something about humans, you're saying something about the connection between human reason and reality, or human mind and reality. So I understand what you're saying, and that's an interesting point, but I'm not 100% sure, like you say, whether or not that is sufficient. One other little thing I was going to say to you, Jordan, as well, as you came, as you mentioned, you sort of came to idealism from sort of a faith position. I think something that I find interesting that kind of comes out of Bradley's initial pitch about what the possibility of metaphysics is, you could take it as saying that, look, we all do metaphysics. There's no way to get around not doing metaphysics. If you say you can't do metaphysics, then you are yourself a metaphysician. And I think there's something for in that we could, it's easy to get tied up in debates about atheism or theism, or some of these other debates that already come loaded with certain concepts, because you have certain concepts you're dealing with. Whereas if you come at things just from what is the nature of reality, everybody has a metaphysics. You can't separate it into sort of an a metaphysics, or like, say you've got theism and atheism, you've got sort of like supposed denial of an entire area of thought, whereas metaphysics is just something that we all have. You either see reality as mechanical or personal or material, or there's something going on. So where, to me, metaphysics can be some kind of Archimedean point for any sort of debate or discussion, that you don't really have the wiggle room. You obviously, you can't force anyone to come to the table and discuss or think about things, but there does seem to be a certain way in which you will have a metaphysics. You won't be able to avoid it. You just might not know what it is. You might not have thought about it. And so it can be a really good sort of jumping off point for any sort of debate. Everyone believes in reality, therefore what?
Yeah. And I don't know if Ryan has anything else to add real quick. I'll just also bring this up that, he also objects to those who say metaphysics is useless. So that's something we'll also touch base on. So what were you going to say, Ryan?
Well, I was going to say that I understand. I mean, in the past, like I've had like people that have like a positivist inclination that is like, oh, well, metaphysics is impossible, or things like that. And then I would say, of course, or like, we can't know reality, things like that. We can only know phenomena, of course. And people like say things like that. Then when you give the Bradleyan reply, they would say, well, I'm not talking about reality. Rather, I'm just talking about like our ideas of things, or I'm just talking about like just the physical world, or something like particular, as opposed to reality as such. And that, now it is an interesting, what you were bringing up, Jordan. So that is an interesting response. And so Bradley, his response ultimately is, so he says in the book, in the introduction, reality is such that we cannot know it. So he maintains that the logical subject of all of our judgments is reality as such, while the grammatical subject, so like whether it be a dog, a cat, I don't know, a mat, whatever it be, that's almost like an addendum, or like an adjective in a sense, that is kind of being ascribed to reality. So it's everything comes back to reality in that sense. So Bradley is kind of here employing a kind of logical maneuver. But then again, though, too, the British idealists, they were very insistent on the importance of the connection between logic and metaphysics, because they also maintained that affirmation goes hand in hand with denial or doubt. So to even say that, I don't know, like to say that A is not B, you have some reason then, if you affirm such a thing, but you have some reason for that. You must have some knowledge of B such that A cannot be B. So it's similar to like even to admit ignorance of something is in effect to possess some knowledge about that of which you're ignorant. And the same thing would the same thing would apply to with reality. Our affirmation of ignorance of reality, well, that's also an affirmation of its existence, our relation to it in a sense. I mean, there's many things that you can derive from just a mere positive affirmation of something, or a negative affirmation for that matter.
Yeah, it's interesting because Frege, his notion of judgment as well is that there's only one kind of judgment. So that's very different to Kant. There's one judgment, and it's just the affirmative. So if we're making a negative claim, we're saying that he takes the negation as part of the content of what's being affirmed. So something, I mean, somewhat similar. So whereas Bradley has the only true object of thought, the only ultimate object of thought is reality that we predicate of. Reality is the subject of everything. Similarly, Frege, and for those who've watched the other Frege videos on YouTube, you'll see every judgment that is passed is taking the thought and saying it refers to this object, the true, which a lot of interpreters take to effectively be reality. So there's even that element in the analytic tradition. Obviously, what happened was that as logic developed from its sort of Fregean roots, the notion of judgment kind of got removed, and any of the sort of epistemological or cognitive elements of our reasoning were removed, and it just became about what follows from what. In some ways, truth got dropped out of it. It just became a truth value. We assign truth values to propositions, etc. But what we're interested in is, suppose P, then let's see what follows from it. So it's just about the connections between thoughts and not about the actual content of those thoughts and what was specifically true. So I guess, yeah, I mean, we were going on a bit of a tangent, but it's interesting to see that sort of Bradley's, I hadn't thought about that before, but his behind the scenes thinking is that every thought is about reality. Everything, whether we seem to be talking about, you know, a cup of tea or the morality of an action, the ultimate subject is going to be the absolute. It's going to be reality. That's all we actually think and talk about is reality. So how could you possibly not do metaphysics?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you might not make these ultimately general claims that you do in metaphysics, sort of trying to say reality is such that, which explicitly tries to talk about reality in the most general fundamental terms, but you can't get away from reality. Obviously, and people try to do it in different ways, but yeah. Sorry, I'm getting all excited here.
No worries.
I thought that was excellent. I agree with all of that.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's good. Oh well, let's start off with some accord. Yeah, great. Okay, so did you have another thing, Jordan, or shall I go on to the next question on my list?
Sure. Yeah. One other thing I'd like to add is, Bradley does address those. I want to say that metaphysics is useless, and I think that's a beautiful transition, because what you were talking about right there, the ubiquity of metaphysics, does get into this, right? These people who want to say it is useless. Well, is that true? Are you saying this is real? If you're saying this is real, that sounds like a metaphysical claim. So people who want to try to dodge and say, I'm just a pragmatist, bro, like I'm just talking about what's useful. Well, you're still identifying such that this is useful. And of course, this brings into, other background assumptions about normativity, value and all that stuff. So like, Bradley once again kind of shows that these people are just once again falling into the same trap as these other guys. So as before, so it's self-defeating. And I don't see how it isn't useful to identify what actually is the case. If we're trying to, let's say, achieve any sort of a goal, right? I'm trying to find something in a forest, whatever, a certain kind of a tree. Isn't it wise to deduce like, okay, well, here's, the steps I can take to get to that. And it really is the case, right? If I'm mistaken what's fact from fiction and I'm not distinguishing anything at all as what's real, how to, it wouldn't be as useful to try to, consider what happened in a fairy tale, to be like, oh, well, maybe I'll just go look for the fairy and then maybe they'll help me find the tree. It's better to take in what's gone in through your experiences to identify them, to categorize them, have conceptual coherency about it, so you can actually navigate that world and do what you have to do. So once again, metaphysics is ubiquitous, as you were just bringing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on that, and I'm interested to actually hear from both of you a little bit, but Bradley also seems to suggest implicitly, when he's dealing with the second argument, that there's a certain attitude about those who want to do metaphysics that seem to be happy for you to ask questions about ultimate reality if you do it in poetry or in religion or in art. And there's all these other ways in which we try to express things that seem to be difficult to express scientifically or in normal language. And yet he seems to think that for some reason people single out metaphysics and say, well, you can think about reality as long as you don't think about it in sort of a rigorous, rational way from first principles. So I'm interested to know whether or not either of you have experienced that, or can sort of see, could understand why there could be a specific, maybe potential hostility to doing it in a rigorous, rational, kind of systematic, structured way, and whether and maybe more from Ryan's point of view, whether or not there were specific philosophers, because obviously it's before the logical positivist movement, so whether there's specific philosophers that Bradley sort of has in the back of his mind, or the type that he's sort of having to feel like he has to deal with early on.
So with respect to those particular philosophers, back in the early or mid 19th century, there was a British philosopher by the name of William Hamilton, Sir William Hamilton. He was a pretty big deal in British philosophy, and he was a proponent of what's come to be known as the relativity of knowledge. And it's before like the theory of relativity, like that's like Einstein relativity. Well, there was a theory of knowledge that was known as the relativity of knowledge. And it's essentially, we can only know things that are as they are relative to our faculties. We can only know, we can't know an ego in itself. We can't know an object in itself. We can only know X in relation to Y. Whenever we try to pursue certain kinds of metaphysical speculation, we end up in antinomies or paradoxes, whether or not these be substantial or not. There was a lot of hostility, and you get this too in people that are much less well known, like Henry Mansell, who is another British philosopher who was actually a theologian, who was a kind of proponent of this, believe it or not, because it leaves room for faith. It leaves room for the mystical side of our nature, in a sense. So maybe these questions aren't meant to be pursued by rational thought. They can only be meditated over, in a sense that is it's reserved for the faculty of faith rather than that of rigorous thought or metaphysical speculation.
So kind of like all knowledge is sort of conditioned.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's also interesting too. So you also have people like Herbert Spencer, who is more well known than the other people that I've mentioned. He was actually very popular among the general public. He was essentially like one might consider him like a public intellectual, or like that you might find on YouTube today, kind of like someone that spouts aphorisms and whatnot, or like pop philosophy, pop psychology, kind of like that. But he also maintained a kind of relativity of knowledge, but he did postulate like an absolute. He just called it the unknown and unknowable. So he said, like, okay, yeah, we can't know anything about the unknown and unknowable, but somehow minds and matter and all that, it's all relative to that, but it somehow emerges from it. Essentially, there was a lot of unclear thinking going on at the time, philosophically speaking, and there was a lot of, I guess, sloppy agnosticism, if you want to call it that, that was propounded. But it's interesting, though, because there is, I think, a lot of hostility to metaphysics because of the word. I think that's unfortunately, yeah, metaphysics is just the name because it came after physics in the chronology of books. But many people think of it as, well, metaphysics. Well, they think of physics and then they think of like, okay, physical objects and things like that. And then they think of, wait a second. So this a supernaturalist kind of like, oh, well, this is like mystical or something, when that's not the case at all. I think the word, if you ask a poet essentially what they see when they are, or what they're writing about, what they're trying to express, they might express something that the common sense person, or the common sense, I mean, the common man, they wouldn't reject in any they wouldn't reject it. They'd be happy to go along with it. And then on the other hand, though, if you have someone in like an ivory tower that uses big words and employs lofty and woolly language and uses words like metaphysics, that could be kind of unpleasant. It could be kind of seen as pompous. And I mean, I think it's a lot of social stigma. I think one of the reasons why many people, I think at the time too, so in Bradley's time, they were kind of skeptical of metaphysics, I think, or the discipline as such. So even back then, philosophy wasn't really as as interdisciplinary. So nowadays there's philosophy of time, philosophy of space and time. There's philosophy of language, philosophy of art, philosophy of travel. I mean,
philosophy of food. Yeah,
it's like I was going to make another joke, but I don't want to say that. Some viewers might understand, but never mind. Yeah, there's a philosophy for everything, or metaphysics of everything too nowadays. Well, kind of. Scratch that last part. Nowadays, though, I think people are they're skeptical of it. I think because they do have a lot of, they associate it with religious thinking and the like. And I think it is just social stigma. I think that's really not as well. It's not well founded in any respect, I would say.
But the guys you were talking about with the unknown and the unknowable, then that sounds like metaphysics to me.
I would say so too. So they kind of reduced metaphysics to psychology in a sense. So okay, they just kind of reduced it to epistemology and then kind of feigned ignorance.
Yeah, so that's similar. I know that, well, both Bradley and Frege were against the psychologicism movement that was effectively saying human reason is just psychology. I mean, you read parts of Frege and he just goes at a particular person in basic laws of arithmetic, just saying, well, so if we evolve differently, would 2 + 2 = 6 or something? And he just thinks that it's the start of the loss of any kind of idea of objective truth. And I think, I think that sort of potential threat, then metaphysics would be sort of the ultimate conceit, then, isn't it? That somehow the human mind, unlimited by psychology, literally can grasp onto the sort of fundamental nature of reality through human reason. So there was that sort of assault going on back then. And I suppose sort of science carries on regardless and just sort of ignores some of that stuff. I don't know if it's still able to or not. The social sciences are sort of spreading their tentacles everywhere a little bit, but it's interesting to see these sorts of things come up again. I
would also add too, another thing that I actually get, I hear a lot too, is the need for humility, but in so much humility that we kind of become entrapped within our own shells in a sense. So we can't. It's like, well, we occupy just this tiny fragment of a tiny planet in a vast universe. What right do you have to? What right gives you? What right do you have to say that we can grasp these particular things? That's another thing too. I think that you get from all people.
No one says that Stephen Hawking if he comes up with the Big Bang Theory. So I mean, it's. I think that might be how it's dressed up, but there's something about. maybe it's to do with some people's views of philosophy overall. Well, it's fine to think about smaller stuff that I don't know. Yeah, but I mean,
I think science gets a free pass here, so like they could do whatever. Like I think that's especially like even like cosmologists too, whether or not you regard that as science strictly speaking. But yeah, I mean, it seems like they're able to get paraded around in like, oh look. Then you have like the philosopher on the other hand, or like the academic philosopher, which whether or not that they're identical, that's a whole other story. It's they are looked at, I think, with a much more hostility, I think, when it or pomposity.
Yeah, so I'll bring Jordan in a second, but just on that, because obviously when metaphysics is done in analytic philosophy, there's a desire to give it some kind of scientific method as a basis. So you've got this sort of principles of success that might be to do with, so say Timothy Williamson says you get your most elegant logic, you get your most powerful logic, you read your ontology from that, and which is how science works. You get your best physical theory, and if the physical theory requires the Higgs boson, then the Higgs boson exists. Or whatever. And so that, I think, is to try and link metaphysics with science in a way that allows it to come across as principled. But you can always then ask the question, well, on what basis do you do that? And really then that seems like it should be a metaphysical question, but then people say, oh, you're doing metaphysics or something. You start to send this sort of regress. And I think what's interesting about Bradley is his criterion is about intellectual satisfaction, which I do think is worth us talking about. Probably a natural thing to go into. But Jordan, do you want to add something? Or
yeah, there's not like a whole lot I'll add on this. One of the things I wanted to bring up is I think a part of why this is happening. Some of you guys already brought up things like positivism, whatever. But just it's the rise of this of scientism, whether that be as an actual epistemological view that science is the only way to know about reality, or it's the best way to know about reality, or just as an attitude that even if they don't hold that strict view of scientism, there's this scientismic attitude. And Massimo Pigliucci talks a bit about this when he talks about the rise of new atheism. I know new atheism is kind of a fad that's died out, but there are still the effects of new atheism, I think, is still echoing in various online circles and all of that stuff, and you still hear what atheists have to say. I know the academy is made up primarily of atheists. If you look up in the Phil Paper survey, lots of philosophers and so on are atheists, and there's this attitude that science is the way to go. And I hate to use this analogy, but it's almost like with the cave, with Plato's cave, where these are sort of like the shadows, and metaphysics is the sun here in a sense where I see science as easier than metaphysics. We can, if you want to know, for instance, like, hey, does eating this diet and doing this routine, does this help you build more muscle mass? Well, we can just measure that and run some experiments and figure that out. It's really simple. We can figure out the structure of how these things behave, but metaphysics goes deeper than that. Metaphysics gets to the content of that structure, the substance of that structure, and identifies what it is instead of what it does. And I think that's harder to do. And it's been undervalued in today's culture, and primarily because it's like a path of least resistance sort of a thing. It's easier to do science, I think, in that sense. And I don't think it's been properly established that a lot of scientists do have metaphysical baggage as well, and those aren't identified and worked through, and they don't talk about how that affects their science as well, and how they interpret their results, and the direction for future experiments and so on. So I think this weird attitude towards science, this worship of the priest in the lab coat, I think is just really kind of led people astray with metaphysics. And I think metaphysics can come back, and I think there can be a consensus in other ways, and it can be established.
Yeah. So on that, Jordan, so obviously, as I said in the introduction, your association with idealism has the stuff I've seen in your channel, for example, is to do more with modern defenders of idealism. Now, what I find with most of the modern defenders is they are taking a similar sort of approach that you're talking about, well, they'll say, well, we can be idealists now because science has said this, quantum physics, that, etc., or something to do with accommodating consciousness within a worldview, or something to do with information. And I heard so Kastrup, who's quite a famous defender of idealism on YouTube, I heard him sort of quite angrily react to Philip Goff in a debate, when Philip Goff said, well, I don't think we need to add all this extra stuff that you're adding to the scientific story. And Kastrup said, well, what extra stuff? I'm not adding any extra stuff. And it seemed to be that, so that you've got the sort of the shut up and calculate idea of science, that science doesn't tell you anything about reality. It's just a system for doing calculations and making predictions. But most people don't think of science that way. Most scientists feel as though they can interpret their theories to say what that tells us about the nature of reality. So there seems to be the reason I got interested in Bradley and some of the more historical idealists was because the contemporary ones I was pursuing seemed to be totally in step to science. They were mainly interested in the world that science talks about, and they were just offering a different way to interpret the scientific story that they thought was better for reasons of parsimony or semantics of meaning and things. And it just didn't seem to me like they were really getting to the heart of the issue. They were already buying too much of the story up front before they started doing metaphysics. And I think that metaphysics is most powerful when it does what Bradley says. It starts with first principles. And then tries to sort of say, well, this is my metaphysics. Where does science fit in my metaphysical worldview? I want to account for science. I mean, they're not anti-scientific. They don't think science is useless or a waste of time. Then that they accept the theories of science. Some might think it's true. Some might say it's not true. It's something else. But they want to account for science within a broader conception of reality. Whereas some of the more recent people seem to be sort of turning things the other way around. They're saying, well, we accept the scientific thought story, but there are certain elements that it's not obvious how they fit with the scientific story. How do you fit consciousness with the scientific story? How do you fit, say, something else, the observer and quantum within the scientific story? Okay, now I can start to do metaphysics. This is where metaphysics fits in. It tries to account for these other things within the scientific story, which seems very, very upside down view. I mean, so metaphysics, as Ryan alluded to, just means after physics. And I think wasn't it Aristotle's book? He had a chapter on physics as a natural world, and then metaphysics that was to do with sort of more abstract stuff.
Yeah, I think it might have been like the
after physics,
the scholastics. I think that category. I think it was the scholastics, or was it someone right after this or before the scholastics? I can't remember, but it was someone after him. So he never called it either. But it was done. Or he never called it metaphysics per se, because it was. Well, I mean, we only have lecture notes now, so besides the point. But I think what you're saying too, though, that many contemporary idealists they do start off within this framework of, okay, so we have this particular scientific picture, right, and then let's try and take these concepts employed in science and either reduce them, try and figure out some possible way to reduce all of these concepts that we have to whether it be like sensa or perceptions or certain kinds of experiences or interrelation between certain phenomenal qualities or whatever. It's essentially, okay, so we have this giant puzzle in a sense, and let's try and I guess if we want to, let's try and fit everything together within these certain constraints. So we can't go outside of the bounds, otherwise we'll be positing something else or what have you. And you also find this too, I think, with the certain idealists that it's kind of ironic. There's what I call like physiological subjectivism. And it's essentially, okay, so science shows that idealism is true because everything that we perceive is an affection of our nervous system or, of our body. I could see it, so my body must be the cause of itself. It's kind of like we get kind of like absurdities like that. And what's interesting is all of these views were mentioned by idealists, like Bradley in my favorite chapter in the book, way ahead. But he explicitly criticizes this kind of stuff and he hammers it down. And we see other philosophers in the 19th century too, like this F.A. Lange, who wrote this massive tome called The History of Materialism. It's 3 volumes, over 1,000 pages long. He actually says that, okay, well, look what physiology and look what the sciences are telling us. So they're saying that, okay, we can only perceive inverted images on the retina, so we don't see things like that. So that's kind of like it's interesting that we kind of have a resurgence of that a little bit again, even though for 100 years it was dead and buried. Again, though, now going back to the British idealists, now they take a very different view. They pursue what's been called like the standpoint of experience. So there's many different departments of experience or different layers. So there's the scientific world, there's the world of ethics, of morality, there's moral experience, and none of these can really be reduced to any other. Exactly. Yeah. None of these can be, we can't reduce moral experience to mere sense experience, nor can we reduce it to perceptual experience in a sense, because it's clear that we don't, we end up in puzzles and paradoxes when we try to, like, for example, the problem of other minds. This is kind of like one of those things too. It's like, well, there's other people, so there's clearly other people with other minds. Now, functioning within this particular standpoint of, okay, all of our knowledge here, it's through our sense organs or through our by means of sensations. Well, sensations clearly aren't people. So how on earth are we going to try and reconstruct the world of experience from a reduction, essentially, to something that's an abstraction? Now, the ways in which different areas of experience they intertwine, that was something that Bradley emphasizes too. He speaks of that, and he has a very, very interesting phenomenology of experience that we don't have to go into. I'm not going to go into, but it's experience is much richer than even contemporary idealists even.
Because things like will, right? He's got things like the will in there and desires, and it's not just what we see. And right.
And in the this, as Bradley calls it, or immediate experience, everything that is essentially, it's the this, or my center of experience. It's like the aperture through which reality is for me, in a sense, and it's not mere patches of color or discrete sounds and things. It's almost like a continuum, and everything crystallizes within that. And it's much more, I think it's a much more elegant and accurate, personally, view of the nature of experience.
Yeah, and I think that if you're wanting to explain everything, trying to start from physical particles is going to be quite a challenge. Whereas if you're starting from the rich complexity of human experience, I think you've got a lot more scope to, and why that's, to me, is the obvious starting point anyway. But I just want to jump into it because it's so easy to get run away with this. But so Jordan, obviously I'd mentioned there a little bit about what I had found looking at some of the more modern idealists and monists, and we've had some conversations about this before. And as you know, I changed my PhD thesis away from a certain sort of topic because of this. How have, I mean, and you're the one that initially brought up sort of criticism of the scientistic worldview. Do you see that has sort of infected some metaphysics. I mean, obviously there's the other sort of metaphysics that people do, where it's just to do with philosophy of language and things, which isn't so much philosophy of science, but certainly more of the popular stuff. But they're not idealist. They're not even thinking that way. But yeah. So anyway, just sort of your comments on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it has unnecessarily restricted our view of the world, but not only that, it's also, in a sense, almost left it too open at the same time. And I'll have to break down what I mean by that a little bit. So people right now are like, when you hear what a lot of these people who talk about the scientific sort of view of the world, how we should value science over it all, they do sort of have this attitude, this sort of weird agnosticism about ultimate reality or about the fundamental nature of existence. And so in a sense, they want to say that they are open-minded about things, that they're willing to look at the evidence and so forth. But when you kind of dig down as to what's meant by evidence in this worldview and what they're really open to, it's not as open-minded. They sort of limit it to what they want to call quote unquote physical phenomenon or quote unquote natural phenomenon. But this isn't really all that well defined in the worldview. And when you really get into what science is, when you actually listen to what some of them have to say, we're talking about the empirical world. We're talking about what we can experience. And on those grounds, I think the idealists can infer all sorts of things. But if we're limiting what we can infer from experience to just what we can measure, what we can repeat, what we can quantify, and we're just stopping there and saying, well, that's about it. Well, we're going to miss the bigger picture here, because that really only, in my opinion, I think science only really identifies the structure of these phenomena. So I think if you're limiting your metaphysics to this and you're just focused on structure and dynamics, you will be left with a very barren view of reality. You won't really even have much of a view of reality. And I think that's why sometimes they react so harshly to metaphysics, because hold on, you're trying to get beyond structure and dynamics. You're trying to actually get at the substance of existence. And to them, I'm sure it's probably causes some anxiety. They're not here to defend themselves right now. I'm just going off of my own personal experiences with people who are more into this attitude. But I think the effect it's had on their metaphysics has just, it's definitely led away from theism. It's led away from moral realism. I think it's opened the door to more of a liberal view of politics and all that stuff for various reasons that I can delve into, but not necessarily in this video. But it's because there's definitely patterns in the beliefs of these people, and just like with religious people, there's, with these atheistic, scientific people, there's an attitude there. And so I just think their metaphysics has just really been damaged because of that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's interesting to hear your thoughts. Thanks, Jordan. Okay, so I think maybe because we've been chatting for a while, let's get back to sort of the introduction that we're looking at. So it's been really nice to talk about some of these broader scale stuff, and really the introduction is good time to do that. But so I've got a couple of questions I think be worth looking at. So, well, I'll throw out. So one thing you guys can say something about, if you like, is sort of the third part of Bradley's introduction, where he's saying about, yes, maybe well, I'll limit it to this, and then we'll go on to something else I think is interesting to talk about. But so in his C argument, he's addressing the potential complaint that everything's sort of been said before, or there's nothing you could want beyond the old philosophies. And his reply is something like, well, every generation needs to rediscover this, re-express this themselves. They need to put it in the context of their own problems, their own situation, and kind of even if he didn't seem to be saying it's definitely the case. There could be something completely fresh and new, but even if not, that doesn't make metaphysics useless or pointless or somehow complete. And some of the things that, well, especially some of the stuff you mentioned, Jordan, is that maybe there's not been a riper time than now to try and rediscover some of these old philosophies and to re-express them in our current context. I mean, I was thinking long and hard about the tagline for my channel, and I ended up with old wisdom for a new world. Because I as much as I'm interested in the 19th century, and it's important to understand their thinking in the context that they had, there's similarities, I think, between the Victorian crisis of faith and kind of a wider crisis of meaning that the 21st century is bringing to us. And I've got a couple of young kids, and it's like, well, what do you tell them? Mm-hmm. There's so much mental health problems for young people. There is, I think, a real sort of anxiety about meaning, about purpose, about culture, about heritage, and it's everything's under attack from so many different ways. Maybe there's something to be said for what Bradley's saying, is that maybe metaphysics can play a role that maybe religion used to play, but wouldn't be able to play in our current context, which is a way of trying to re-express some earlier ways of seeing the world. Or it's not necessarily earlier, that I think these things are timeless, but rediscover some of these broader, what I call full-blooded pictures of reality, rather than the relatively bloodless, mechanistic ones that we sort of passively, I think, and usually uncritically adopt from the world of technology and science that we live in. I mean, okay, so I'm going off a little bit more, but similarly, going back to this idea of these sort of modern idealisms, a lot of them are now about simulation theory, and like we're living in this is almost like what the only sort of way we can reach to a kind of idealism reduces it to noughts and ones of sort of technology and computer and science, etc. It's again, you're not going to be able to ground any kind of value system or meaning to life from that, or multiverses and these sorts of stuff. It's almost like there's no imagination beyond something that connects with, or if it doesn't sound scientific, it has no kind of credibility or something. And it bears repeating, I'm not against science. I think science is wonderful. It's just, if it's elevated to the status of the ultimate arbiter of all things, or some kind of idol or god that we all have to bow down to, then maybe it is time to sort of rediscover the old philosophies and express them again to our current culture, generation, or context that we find ourselves in.
What you were saying, what you were saying about like simulation theory and like multiverse stuff, and how these idealistic systems, or systems that claim to be idealist, that are being propounded today, it seems to there's all this hype, and then it's a letdown in a sense. You kind of you're not satisfied. It's like you expect something kind of substantive, in a sense that I think many readers that were anticipating a kind of an answer to all these questions of like, okay, the nature of the soul, and when they were reading a Bradley and things like that. Okay, so what now? Like, will we have immortality? Will we have this, that, whatever? It reminds me, the effect that these contemporary idealist systems have. It reminds me of this passage from Bradley's Principles of Logic, where he says that it may come from a failure in my metaphysics, or from a weakness of the flesh which continues to blind me, but the notion that existence could be the same as understanding strikes as cold and ghost-like as the joyous materialism. That the glory in the end, glory of the world in the end is appearance, leaves the world more glorious. And he then goes on to say that, but the sensuous curtain. So, well, let me back up a second. That the glory of this world in the end is appearance, leaves the world more glorious, if we feel it is a show of some fuller splendor. But the sensuous curtain is a deception and a cheat. If it hides the colorless movement of atoms, some spectral woof of impalpable abstractions, or unearthly ballet of bloodless categories. So the whole ballet of bloodless categories, that reminds me of like, I become, it's like, if we're stuck with a simulation idealism, or a physiological idealism, kind of like, okay, well, we're all kind of trapped in our own brains in a sense, because we can only perceive our own ideas, and our ideas are affections of our brains. It does strike as cold as the dreariest materialism. It's no different from a bloodless ballet of categories in a
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, definitely. And I think when there's so much out there that sort of seems like, oh, that's really interesting. It'll be some kind of title that grabs you, like science has proved this or something. And but then when you really look into it, you realize that it doesn't really deliver on what it promises. What it actually delivers is something that's just a play on concepts. Or so, for example, when I first started to get into metaphysics, I came across Timothy Williamson's book about necessitism. And in the first chapter, it sounds amazing. He says that, in this world is full of things that we don't realize. Sort of, there are possible coins. And my grandfather, who died like 3 years ago, he still is still something. He doesn't say exists. It's still my grandfather still. And then, but then when you read later, it's just because the most parsimonious logic has a domain which includes all objects at all times and in all possibilities. So it acts as the truth guarantors of our semantics or something. And so it turns out that a possible coin is just it's just about how he's moving his theory around. So it sort of starts off with what seems like this grand, sort of powerful metaphysical claim about the nature of being, and it turns out to just be some kind of simplification of a logical theory. And I think there's a temptation for that to happen. And so simulation theory seems sort of like that, like it can sound cool, but actually it presents the world as even less deep or impressive or glorious, to use Bradley, less glorious. It then becomes a different kind of bloodless categories of sort of noughts and ones, and sort of,
even like information theory and things like that, or what else, like even when you hear of like scientists talking about the nature of space and time too, or or strings or whatever. I mean, like block universes that they propose. Well, it's not in any sense. It doesn't capture that. It doesn't satisfy. It's like you're expecting something on it, and it fizzles out essentially. But it does have a tendency to almost hypnotize in a sense, because especially too when you try and look into this kind of stuff, it can be kind of intimidating in a sense too, because even in like philosophical circles too, there's like philosophy of space-time, philosophy of color, philosophy of all this. You kind of become like terrified. If I'm going to say anything, well, I need like a degree in this particular area of philosophy. Like you almost become entrapped and unable to you're kind of it's essentially the way that things are so specialized now, as opposed to when Bradley was writing. There's it becomes much more difficult to try and criticize too, if you were to like analyze some of like what's being said and or taken for granted among like scientists, or even like in contemporary culture and things like that, or even in philosophy too. It could be very difficult to point out that things are not what they seem in a sense. There's like this, like a proposed theory of some kind. Well, it might have inconsistencies or inaccuracies in the way that it's done. Like, for example, like as before, like with physiology and perception and things like that. I was flipping through the Encyclopedia of Perception the other day, looking at like the concept of whole neural representations and things like that, which you hear about in cognitive science. And the writers and talking about how, well, yeah, these sensations and things like that, the colors and so on, well, they don't exist in things. They exist in your brain, like patches of color, things like that. Well, they don't have any existence. Like, this is not black. It's all in your head. It's all in your brain. Well, it leaves problems, contradictions, inconsistencies that are not satisfactorily resolved in those areas.
Chapter 1, Bradley attacks the primary secondary quality distinction. So the next one we're going to be looking at delves exactly into that. I'm hoping to do a video on Locke's views before we talk about that. But
that was all over the place though. So that was, but I tried to at the very end tie it down to that whole issue of satisfaction, which I think you wanted to go into more.
Yeah. One thing I was also going to say on that, and
sure.
And get George's thing is that sometimes, and partly why I'm doing the channel in the format that I'm doing it, and why we're having these discussions and we're going slowly through things, is I think there is, and there clearly is a sort of, for want of a better phrase, a sort of a spiritual hunger for something more, meaning, value, etc., beyond the kind of neoliberal life that we find ourselves living. And these sort of headlines about quantum physics or something are really appealing, and they sort of, but they aren't, they're not transformative enough. They're sort of these ideas that can slot quite neatly into our current way of viewing the world, because they're just saying that you already view the world scientifically, but hey, science has said, well, maybe to try and account for different wave collapses, or we've got all these other multi-universes out there, and that sounds cool, or but then actually conceptually that can make your life feel less meaningful, because there are billions of me in different worlds or whatever. So there is that, but what I found is that you truly need to dive into something long term that doesn't neatly fit into your current worldview, that does start to untangle it a little bit and open up a space to see things differently. But that only happens if you take the time and you sit in it, and you go slowly and you let things go off layer by layer. I mean, there's no shortcut to transforming your overall worldview, for your metaphysics to really get dug up and replaced. And I think I'm 11 years in now to studying philosophy in a formal way, and then years before that thinking about this sort of stuff. And it takes a long time for that to happen. I'm hoping that as we go through these people slowly and systematically, and whoever comes along and follows on things, that can start to happen, hopefully. Anything on that, Jordan, or should we go on to the...
Yeah, let's move on to the next topic.
Yeah, so maybe we'll talk about these two things together. So you can talk about Bradley's notion of intellectual satisfaction, or the idea that metaphysics is about trying to satisfy a certain part of human nature. But also, I wanted to ask about whether or not, because obviously one of the drawbacks of metaphysics seems to be that it's very hard to get a consensus, and we're talking quite generally about the British idealists said this or this or whatever, but obviously there's a lot of variation in the metaphysical views of the British idealists and others. Do you think that metaphysics, there's possible to get a consensus on metaphysics? Whether you think that the metaphysical consensus is something that just sort of happens below the radar as such, like you'd mentioned, sort of a scientistic or materialist metaphysics, or like Jordan, you'd mentioned people in yourself and in religious context maybe automatically have a dualist metaphysics. You've got the natural world, the physical world, and the spiritual world, or something. Do you think the consensus is possible? Do you think metaphysics done in a sort of a philosophically rigorous way influences that, or is it purely reflective? Is it just a case of unpacking your own biases or intuitions? Or, I mean, you might have something more to say on this, Jordan, since it sounds as though you underwent a shift in your metaphysical thinking.
Yeah, because I know Bradley sort of has this idea of metaphysics as just finding, bad reasons to justify. Oh gosh, I'm butchering that quote. Ryan knows what I'm saying. Oh yeah. Well, can you say it, or what do you remember?
Metaphysics is the finding of bad reasons for things that we believe upon instinct, but the finding of said reasons is no less an instinct. I think that's what it is.
Something along those lines. Yeah, and I understand that, but
it's in the preface. Yeah, it's one of his.
So we skipped the preface, but it's yeah, that's
pretty good. But like but I'm gonna have to kind of disagree with Bradley on that. I understand why he would think that way, especially if you go to understand human psychology. But I do think that we're not just, I don't believe in this atomistic view of humans. I guess I don't think we're just merely just these individuals and we're just all individually trying to figure it out one by one. And we're like, trying to herd stray cats almost, trying to get it all together. I think humans are very naturally tend towards groups, and we learn in groups, we learn in languages, we learn in different cultures and nations. And I think there is, when people say there can't be consensus in metaphysics, I think maybe in the ivory tower and stuff, it can be a bit strange, but there is still consensus there. And I think among the lay people in general, you can sort of survey them and find these general trends among them, at least as an average. And so there does seem to be this idea in which maybe it's downstreamed from the academy in conjunction with political authority and other, popular figures in entertainment and so on. But I think if everything were to, in a sense, come together, right? If there was a sort of movement toward academia and entertainment and so forth, if there was this sort of agreement there, I think there could be this downstream effect where you could, in a sense, have this consensus. And I think that's what's already happening right now. People are very, I think one or the other in many ways, very materialistic and dualistic. And they're at, they're going head to head. There's no clear one over the other, over the people, but you can see in large degree, even though there's many different views of reality, these two predominate. And I think idealism can definitely come back and join the table and could even become a consensus if we come to understand arguments like the ones that Bradley brings up. Because I think it has this advantage, like I brought up in the past, but I won't get too far into that. But just what you were saying about consensus and whether it can be achieved, I think it definitely can be. And I think people, they do look to authority for certain things, and they should for certain reasons. And I think the more philosophy is better understood, we get away from this scientism, and we really learn to appreciate how ubiquitous and important metaphysics is, we'll begin to look towards the metaphysicians more. And instead of, when we don't understand them, we don't just dismiss them as quacks. We just, maybe question ourselves and go, okay, maybe I just have more to learn. Maybe there's just, just like with the scientists, if people don't understand everything the biologist has to say about evolution, we sort of give them a pass. We sort of go, okay, well, maybe I don't have a degree in biology. I'll, have to, be patient with them, and I'll trust them. And I'm not talking about a blind faith in metaphysicians, but I think there will be in the future, I hope, I pray that people will come to appreciate metaphysics, and there will be more properly appreciated authorities. And with that, I think consensus can be more easily obtained, I guess.
Yeah,
I would disagree, actually. I don't think I'm going to be a pessimist here. It's I honestly I would agree with McTaggart here. So McTaggart says it's impossible that there's ever going to be a consensus in metaphysical speculation or metaphysical theories, because if it were the case that many of our common, well, maybe I might disagree with what McTaggart says from it, but I don't think a consensus is going to be possible, or at least a consensus in the academia about certain concepts of the nature of qualities, or the nature of space and time relations. Or when we think of consensus too, of course, now that philosophy has been so specialized, there's like a department for everything now. So you could be like a jack of all traits in a sense, and you could like dabble in a little bit of everything. But no one, unfortunately, it's not as easy as it used to be, when you could craft an entire system of the universe and have a category corresponding to every single thing, whether it be in mechanics, organics, chemism, ethics, whatever. Nowadays, that kind of stuff is looked down. It's viewed as something much less is not really practical, or I wouldn't even dare say possible nowadays. Like, for example, like an entire system that to recreate like a Hegelian system, that's not going to, there's time, money, you're not going to be able to do it. And I don't think with respect to consensus, what is it that we are having a consensus about now? So is it going to be this particular tiny aspect of some even smaller aspect of philosophy, whether it be in logic or whether it be in aesthetics? I honestly don't think, even in metaphysics too, like questions just as to monism or pluralism or the nature of more contemporary discussions like emergence or even in certain interpretations of like physics. I honestly think that a problem is that one problem is the obsession with puzzles. I think that is something which I think many people that are interested in metaphysics, they often focus on. So, for example, certain paradoxes, like the paradox, like the Sorites paradox, the paradox of the heap, where if we have a pile of grain, take one piece of grain off it, well, clearly it's going to be still a heap. Okay, if you keep doing that, okay, when does the heap begin and when does it end? I mean, someone could spend their entire life just focusing on something like that. Now, whether or not the entire philosophic community is going to have a consensus with respect to whether or not something's a heap, I don't really think that's very important per se, nor do I think it's very practical to even do something like that. I think metaphysics, it's something that, contrary to what Jordan was saying, is something that's deeply individual. I think it has much more to do with the temperament and the personality, as well as the values of individual people. So what someone deep down, what they strive for in their own life, what they strive for to see in their communities, and what they value and privilege, that's going to, I think, deeply affect their metaphysical views, as well as everything that is derivative therefrom. And to then even try to share or try to convince people of different metaphysical views. Like there's an old saying, you're either like an Aristotelian or a Platonist, I think. People are almost predisposed in a sense to certain kinds of views, and they kind of, they just develop from that. I honestly don't think that something as deep as metaphysics can be subject to a consensus. If that was the case, I would actually be I'd be nervous about that. I'd be very, I'd be concerned in a sense, because I think that's one of the things that we have today, believe it or not. There's these, especially in academia too, there's very little, I can't really speak of it, but at least from the outside, it appears that novelty or returning to what Bradley says, a skeptical study of first principles, that's just not welcome, I don't think. Financial reasons too. I mean, who's gonna pay for this? Are you going to be paying to pursue this career? I mean, even nowadays too, if you say that you have a degree or you're pursuing a degree in philosophy, people might say, well, what are you going to do with that? Like, you can't really, that's not very practical, or things like that. I think the stigmas that surround philosophical speculation, both inside academia and outside academia, as well as the underlying basis of these, of the very pursuit of metaphysics, whether it be done in poetry or in art, because metaphysics, so it is not strictly limited to the philosophical pursuit of it. So it can be done, as Bradley says, through poetry, art, music, literature, so on. I think when you consider the vast variety of other forms and media that engage in metaphysics, you start to realize that there's this plenum of different views. And to be perfectly frank, I would find it rather dreary if there was not this richness in different particular views as to the nature of reality. Schopenhauer says that different metaphysicians or metaphysical systems are like spiders, each in their own web, and they fight each other essentially to the death. And Schopenhauer, in his one of his books, he says that, will there ever be a theory that emerges on top? And I don't think there will ever be, to be honest. I think these perennial questions will always be circulated. Of course, there'll be progressions and evolutions in forms of discussion and different ways of thinking about things. But I honestly don't think there will ever be an end of metaphysics that culminates in a consensus.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's yeah, interesting stuff. Okay, so I mean, there are different levels of consensus, obviously, aren't there? I mean, we can debate the Socrates paradox and whether that's an issue of vagueness, or we have a different kind of logical system or whatever. But there are these sort of underlying assumptions that sort of seem to undergird things. I mean, there was a survey done. I've seen it a couple of times. It's often quoted, and I think it was done by, I think it might have been Chalmers and someone else. So they just went and asked philosophers some of these deep foundational questions and just tallied up, this percentage of philosophers said this, and it's quite funny, the ones that came out. So something that Jordan sort of pointed to, some of the biggest ones that had the most obvious swings were things like for atheism, for example, and other things that they ask about your theory of truth, and most people were correspondence theorists, a few deflationists and that sort of stuff. But if you look at them, the thing is, I once saw someone quoting it in an interview with a philosopher, and the response was exactly the right one, saying that, yeah, well, you say most philosophers are correspondence theorists of truth or whatever, but most philosophers haven't looked at theories of truth because of the specialization you're talking about. So what that represents is more the sort of thing that maybe Bradley's alluding to. This is just this instinct of, well, truth is something to do with what I think matching up with facts, and that's correspondence theory. Or just that the discipline as philosophy, especially analytic philosophy, has distanced itself from philosophy's often religious roots and become more scientific roots. Well, that means more atheists gravitate to it. And so this survey maybe demonstrates less. I mean, obviously there were certain philosophers who specialize in, say, theories of truth or philosophy of religion or something that have more considered views on this topic that represents. But you can't, it's not like asking a physicist whether they think that the Standard Model or quantum field theory is a better explanation, where if they're going to give an answer, it's because they've thought about it. There's a limit, because philosophy is so broad. So consensus happens, but maybe it does happen as more on those foundational questions in this more sort of instinctive level. But then on the flip side, I also would disagree with Bradley, what he says about instinct, unless he's meaning instinct in a very unreflective sense. Because I certainly found with philosophy, a lot of it has been a case of trying to then conceptualize and articulate my views on things. I would have, with a lot of this stuff, have been agnostic. I mean, I hadn't thought about truth before, and I probably would have been a correspondence theorist, but I think there's a lot to be said for Bradley's identity theory, for example. Now, is that finding bad reasons for what I believe upon instinct? No, but the reason I think that is because it connects better with probably what my deepest convictions are. So maybe looking at something like Quine holism, we have certain beliefs that are very close to our heart for whatever reason, and we explore those, and we then recognize, well, I sort of unreflectively assume this, but that conflicts with this, which is to me the more important, and so it becomes this process of self-discovery, of refining and getting clear in our thinking, more precise. But I think the sort of consensus would be good is that maybe stuff that we would all agree on, which is a consensus that maybe the unreflective following of what people's idea of a scientific worldview is can be a little dethroned, and at least we make space for the myriad sort of metaphysical stuff that we get. And obviously that's where I like metaphysics to spill out as something like intellectual satisfaction, rather than, well, we buy into this way of doing ontology. We buy into this way of so if anyone's watched the Russell's theory of descriptions, once you get to your idea that the subjects of your sentences, what you talk about, what exists are, what you're quantifying over, what your quantifiers hit, then the question is just, well, what objects are in my domain? So it becomes this very sort of technical way of approaching it. To have a consensus, first of all, the metaphysics is needed, again, that there's the space for this to be expressed. And obviously, with a lot of these grand metaphysical theories, they have their own terminology, they have their own concepts that they deploy with specific meanings. I mean, language, it has to be used in a creative way. They're almost sort of entire worldview that you sort of buy into and you think in terms of. So it's a bit rambly, I suppose, but I think so. Philosophy kind of has this push and pull symbiotic relationship with our deepest convictions. Some of it is trying to justify those deepest convictions. Others is relation back and forth. And actually, on that, I was asked an interview at Cambridge for my scholarship. Because I'd mentioned on there some of my my relationship with Christianity and faith, and the interviewer, the only kind of real kind of put me on the spot question I got was, how do you, as a philosopher, where philosophy teaches you to question everything, reconcile that with a faith where you believe things without question? And I said what I would say exactly the same again now, which is that I don't think that people of faith do accept everything without question. And I don't think philosophers question everything either. I think that we all are trying to fit the pieces of our various beliefs as a puzzle together and try and work things through and work things out. Every philosopher I know has certain deep convictions about the nature of the world, and then tries to think through what that means. And similarly, there is certainly constitutionally wired people who have a faith will approach it intellectually as well. So yeah, I think that's some of the beauty of philosophy, and what I like about metaphysics is it doesn't come with the baggage that religious debates have. And so I find it a much freer environment in which to talk about the nature of reality than theology, for example, or something else. Yeah,
I thought what you said about correspondence theory, for instance, I think that was a good observation there, is that sometimes this consensus, if we can call it a consensus, if it's there, sometimes it's not always there because of a critical examination of the facts. It's something that's just kind of in the background. It's not always questioned, and you just get taught this and it's presupposed, and it just kind of goes on. And I don't think that's always necessarily a bad thing, honestly. I think it's possible that idealism could become something like that. And if it did become a consensus among it, among like the public or whatever, it would be something like that, sort of like how materialism or dualism is. That I don't think, everybody's into metaphysics or philosophy of mind per se. But like if every time you're on television or movies, whatever, if they show you what an intellectual is, and it's always this materialistic scientist every time, and anybody who resembles philosophy, they sort of have this image of a disheveled, schizo kind of a guy. I mean, the general public will naturally kind of get these impressions. I think in this, this applies to everything, in music, television, just literature and entertainment, everywhere in academia. So I think it's possible to, in a sense, how to put this, I guess. I mean, to teach the people this, yes, but it will be, if it is a consensus, I think it would be like how the correspondence theory would be. It would be really much more of like a background view than anything. And if it were consensus in academia, it wouldn't be like anything as large as 76%, I believe, and so forth. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To go back to what was being said about that aphorism, metaphysics is the finding of bad reasons for what we believe upon instinct, but to find these reasons is no less an instinct. I think it's interesting because there's many ways to interpret that. What I personally think it's kind of sarcastic, but at the same time, though, it's interesting because Bertrand Russell, an opponent of Bradley, who was a student of Bradley's, and then rival, Bertrand Russell maintained in his History of the Western Philosophy that he was criticizing St. Thomas Aquinas. Russell said, the finding of arguments for a conclusion given in advance is not philosophy, it's special pleading. It's kind of funny, though, because is it really the case that philosophers they question everything, or they are so caught up in being almost like Cartesian doubt, when in fact, it doesn't seem to be the case. Even Bertrand Russell, he's well known for his Principia Mathematica, where he tries to reduce all mathematics to logic. I think it was Anthony Kenny that said it's funny that Bertrand Russell would say such a thing, that when in fact he spends hundreds and hundreds of pages trying to prove that 2 + 2 = 4. And it's something that he believed his entire life. So he's trying to find all of these. I mean, if you try and open up the book, I mean, it's indecipherable. It like all of these symbols and so on, all these elaborate and complex proofs for something that's 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, it's kind of like whether or not that's a bad reason to believe something that you believe upon instinct. I mean, that's another story. But it's there are certain things, though, I think that philosophers do carry with them certain kinds of guiding principles that illuminate their path forward. And I think intellectual satisfaction is definitely one of those, that hunger for completeness and coherence. It's something that is, of course, instinctual. I think we have it in all. It encompasses our entire life, and it manifests itself in different ways. There's definitely a satisfaction that enters itself into moral experience, aesthetic experience. That's, as you were saying in one of your videos too, it's not mere taste, like David Hume, like with aesthetic judgments, things like that. It's not mere just fancy. It's something that's much more spiritual. And it is something that is perennial in a sense too. We're able to identify certain kinds of we encounter the sublime, and we're able to appreciate it. We're able to look into certain situations and be met with something that is humbling in a sense, but there's also at the same time like a satisfaction, like an awe at the power of certain aspects of experience. Whether it be when you go into a museum and you basically absorb what is being what's there on display for you. And I mean, there's the richness of culture, art, literature, whether it be in music. There's always, with the creation of such media, as well as with the consuming of it, or the receiving of it, or the appreciation. That's probably a better word than just consuming it. Appreciation, I think. That's there is a give and take there, in the sense that there's a satisfaction in the feeling, or in the striving to make it concrete, and like an idea to try and solidify it in something that's preserved. But at the same time, there's a reward that is fulfilled in understanding it and appreciating it. And I think that's something which Bradley, he himself tries to make use of heavily he frequently points towards, okay, we have this particular principle that's our guiding light. It's infallible in a sense. We cannot dispose of it without utter ruin. Not just himself, but anyone that would dispose of such a principle, whether or not they recognize it as such, they would thought and just every activity or every aspect of our human life, it would be radically changed if we were to set aside such a criterion, I think. So I'm going off on a tangent. I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I think obviously it's important that for him it's intellectual satisfaction. It's not sort of satisfaction.
Right, because he does distinguish. He does say, well, this can't be. It would be impossible for a satisfaction of our whole nature. Nor does metaphysics. It demands such a satisfaction of our whole nature. But yeah, so you are correct. Intellectual satisfaction. That's what he strives for.
Yeah, and what I think, as we talked just before we started this discussion, as I've said to you guys before, is that what's interesting is that's not actually a million miles away from where a lot of debates in even analytic metaphysics come down to. If you with some of the philosophy of religion debates as well, often it reaches a certain point where you've got one theory over here, you've got another theory over there. Even in science, I mean, we've now got different sort of accounts for quantum mechanics, and then the question is, well, which theory is more elegant, or which is more parsimonious, or which is your stronger system, and then say, well, that's the one we go for. But that's not a matter of, well, you have to further justify that the most elegant, strong system is the true one. No, instead it's, well, strength is something to do with its practical uses or how explanatory it is. Which is, why do we care something to be explanatory? Because it satisfies our
exactly. They're all aesthetic judgments. Yeah, exactly.
A stronger, better explanation is more intellectually satisfactory. Mm-hmm. Why do we want a more parsimonious theory? Why do we not want to have pointless objects floating around that don't help us explain anything? Well, because it's less intellectually satisfactory if we have unnecessary components in our theory, or it's aesthetically worse. When you talk about elegance of a theory, that's an aesthetic claim. So it's quite interesting that I think Bradley's ultimate criterion for metaphysics fits his worldview. Metaphysics is the fundamental intellectual pursuit that everything knowledge that everything else has to fit into. And so there could not be a criterion for it that was intellectual and intellectual, the satisfaction element says we're looking for something intellectual, but it's judged on the basis of its capacity to satisfy us, which is something to do with aesthetics. And I also do think certain practical, it has to be, I think, workable in terms of how you then live or act or whatever, because he has that ethical morals strand in it. So we can talk about this a little bit, and we do need to wrap things up quite soon.
Sure.
But
I actually have a question for you real quick about what you were just saying and how it relates to analytic philosophy, the notion of intellectual satisfaction. Do you think that, because Bradley says that we assume that reality satisfies the intellect too. He insists upon that. And he takes that as a statement of it's faith, of course, because it can't be proven, but whether or not you want to deny it, that's I wouldn't want to deny that. Do you think that analytic philosophy, when they speak of theories and things like that, or when it comes to different logical systems, do you think that they would go so far as to say that, would they go as far as Bradley in saying that reality is doing it, or that we should maintain that these particular theories, are they saying something like we should hold to these particular theories simply because it does satisfy us? Do they want to extend this stuff to beyond our? Are they trying to? Do you think that they try and sever the division between thought and being in such a sense, or do they want to, like Bradley, in a sense, try to dissolve the dualism? Essentially, is satisfaction something that is strictly in analytic philosophy when it comes to logic and different scientific systems? Is that to the people that are making these decisions, would you say that they are not wanting to enter or not wanting to extend this principle towards reality or things in themselves or whatever they might say is beyond the theory? Or do you think that they want to establish a continuity between the two?
So, I mean, yeah, so analytic philosophy often revolves around language, and then so you have your language that you, and this isn't necessarily natural language, but this is certainly the way that a lot of the people that I've been reading sort of approach things. And then you'll have so in this language, you have these sentences that are grammatically well formed. These are the rules in which they be true or false, these are the truth conditions, and then this is what they mean. And then we'll have this other system which can prove theorems or not within the system. So it's a very sort of set up, formal system. And then you have your meta language, which is the way you talk about the language. And then what is the meta language? And so there are some that think that there is a sort of a privileged kind of language that allows you to really talk about the world. So I'm stepping a little bit beyond what I know a lot about. There's a chap, Ted Sider, who talks about the ontology room, that when we step into the ontology room, then we speak in a way that what we're saying really does commit us to the existence of things, but then we talk in much looser terms. And so there are some people who try to connect a way to reach out to reality in terms of bridging that gap. But there's a lot of criticisms on that, because a lot of the criticisms leveled against the other layers, and well, how come they don't apply to this supposedly privileged language? Is there any way to reach some sort of solid foundation in what we say, where we really mean what we say, or we were talking within a language, within a theorem? So obviously, and then the little I know about the logical positivists and Carnap, they were sort of skeptical that we could ever do that. So everything is sort of only within the language or within the theory, according to the truth conditions, blah. So, but then from a practical point of view, obviously, the way you go with some of these things, there are elements of argument, and then there are elements of what you find likely or satisfactory. So it's a mixed bag. And if at any point you say this is the way to do ontology of what exists, then for me that just opens up the metaphysical question again of why that criteria, not another. So yeah, I think Bradley's principles is a good one to go by. And it does somewhat personalize the quest, but I didn't actually read Bradley as saying that sort of, well, all you're really doing in your metaphysics is sort of unpacking what satisfies you, because he does sort of say, no, in the first, the A argument, that you've got no reason to say it's impossible to have. He says something like, I even venture to say, I think I have some certain knowledge of the absolute. So he doesn't see it just as a private quest or sort of a personal individual journey. He thinks that there are ways to, you're talking about something public, that you can, well, obviously his theories of degrees of truth, you can hit the target closer and closer, that sort of thing. So yeah, I in some ways his criterion of intellectual satisfaction, which we'll see will do a lot of work for him in the first book, isn't in some ways a million miles away from what I think is the general practice in analytic philosophy and probably scientific approaches as well. That once you're getting outside of a theory and you're comparing theories with each other, you have to rely on these outside of your theory criteria for it. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, this has been great. I think we're about 2 hours now. So yeah, I'm sure we could keep talking, but that I think that's been quite good. We've the introduction was quite open, so it allowed us to talk about sort of metaphysics broadly and some things like that. But haven't heard from you for a little while, Jordan. Is this something you want to sort of?
No, actually, it seems like a good place to sort of leave off. I think we'll start getting into a lot more interesting stuff when we get into chapter 1 and see what else Bradley has to say.
Yes. So the first chapters can be a little repetitive in some ways. He uses the same kind of argument style to take down various concepts. But I think what will be helpful for us when we're discussing it is, well, first of all, we'll have specific arguments to sink our teeth into, try and think about the structure of them and how convincing they are. But also, it's helpful to see why he's targeting these certain concepts. So why is it important to show that the distinction between primary and secondary qualities is problematic. So that's the next one we're going to look at, how that's tied to indirect realism and bits and pieces. So we can talk about all of that. Yes, so we're getting into some specifics. We've had a great chat, I think, about some of the broad level questions and ideas about metaphysics and where we are now and how it relates to our culture. So hopefully that's been good, and you guys have enjoyed it. Those who've been listening along, and congratulations for reaching this point. And big thank you to Ryan and Jordan. You've been excellent companions on this, and look forward to continuing this conversation as we read further through the book.
Yeah, thank you very much. Likewise.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Looking forward to next time.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.